A duke may refuse a crown of roses, but he cannot refuse the one truth that survives in the dark. By the time the 10th noble bride lowered her eyes in shame, the great hall of Blackthorn Hall had grown so silent that even the candles seemed afraid to breathe. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood beneath the carved oak balcony with his hands clasped behind his back, his black evening coat cut with severe perfection, his pale face unreadable in the gold tremble of 100 flames. Before him stood Lady Margaret Ellison, daughter of an earl, wrapped in ivory, silk, and pearls, her smile slowly dying as every guest waited for the answer she had been raised to expect. Around her, 9 other young women glittered like careful offerings, daughters of marquises, granddaughters of generals, heiresses whose dowries could repair roofs, buy horses, and silence creditors for generations. Their mothers watched with stiff necks. Their fathers held their breath behind crystal glasses. The entire county had come to witness the great choosing, the night when the widowed Duke of Blackthorn would finally take a wife and restore warmth to a house that had forgotten music. Alexander looked at Lady Margaret for one long moment, not cruelly, not kindly, but with the distant weariness of a man examining a locked door he had no wish to open. "No," he said. One word, soft enough to be polite, sharp enough to cut every ribbon in the room. Lady Margaret's fan trembled. Somewhere near the fireplace, a woman gasped into her glove. The orchestra, which had been waiting for permission to play, remained frozen with bows hovering above strings. 10 noble brides had come to Blackthorn Hall that winter evening, each dressed as if destiny could be persuaded by satin, jewels, and a perfect curtsy. 10 had been presented to him. 10 had spoken of duty, lineage, loyalty, and the honor of becoming Duchess of Blackthorn. And 10 had been refused. Not dismissed with anger, not insulted, simply seen through. That was what made it unbearable. At the far edge of the hall, near the narrow passage that led to the kitchens, Clara Bennet stood with a silver tray held carefully in both hands. Her wool dress was brown, plain, and too thin for the draught that crept beneath the tall windows. A faint burn reddened the back of her wrist where hot broth had splashed earlier while she was helping a younger servant steady a heavy pot. No one had noticed. No one ever truly noticed Clara unless they needed someone to blame, someone to fetch, someone to step aside. She was not a guest. She was not quite a servant. She was the daughter of Thomas Bennet, the late stable master, kept at Blackthorn after his death by an old arrangement no one liked to discuss. In drawing rooms, they called her unfortunate. In corridors, they called her Charity. Lady Vivian Cross, whose emerald gown made every other woman seem pale, turned her head just enough to see Clara standing in the shadow. A small smile touched her mouth. "Perhaps His Grace has exhausted the noble options," she murmured, sweet as poisoned honey. "How tragic. Soon he may have to ask the girl no one wanted." A ripple of laughter moved through the hall, soft, elegant, merciless. Clara's fingers tightened around the tray until the silver edge pressed cold into her skin. She did not look down. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury for people who had rooms of their own. Duke Alexander heard the laughter. His eyes, gray and still as winter glass, shifted past the pearls, past the silk, past Lady Vivian's perfect smile, and stopped at the kitchen doorway. For the first time that evening, something in his expression changed. Not warmth. Not yet. Recognition, perhaps. Or the first crack in an old wall. Clara felt his gaze before she dared to meet it. Across the long stretch of marble, candlelight, and judgment, the Duke of Blackthorn turned away from 10 noble brides and looked directly at her. Clara Bennet had been looked at all her life, yet almost never seen. There was a difference, and she knew it as surely as she knew the cold path from the servants' stairs to the eastern stable, the loose stone near the pantry door, and the exact hour when the wind began to cry through the upper windows of Blackthorn Hall. People looked at her when a glass was empty, when a hem was muddied, when a door needed closing, when some small inconvenience required a quiet pair of hands. They looked at her the way one looked at a candle after the flame had gone out. Useful once, forgotten now. But the Duke's gaze was not like that. From across the marble floor, Alexander Whitmore watched her with a stillness that made the laughter around her fade into something thin and far away. Clara felt heat rise beneath her fair skin, not from pride, but from the terrible discomfort of being noticed in a room that had already decided she should not exist. Lady Vivian Cross turned fully now, her emerald skirts whispering over the floorboards like leaves dragged across a grave. "Miss Bennet," she said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear, "do step into the light." His Grace appears to have developed an interest in household curiosities. More laughter, polished laughter, the kind that never raised its voice because it had never needed to. Clara lowered the tray to a nearby table with careful hands. The red mark on her wrist stung beneath the lace edge of her sleeve, but she did not touch it. "I am needed in the kitchen, my lady," she said softly. Her voice did not tremble, and that seemed to offend Lady Vivian more than any reply could have. How dutiful, how touching. Though one wonders what duty truly belongs to a girl who is neither servant nor family. A few guests shifted, delighted and uneasy at once. Everyone at Blackthorn knew Clara's story in fragments, and society adored fragments because they allowed cruelty to dress itself as curiosity. Her father had served the Whitmore family for 26 years. He had died during the winter of the old scandal, the same winter the Duke's younger brother was lost beyond the North Woods. After that, Clara had remained. Fed, clothed, tolerated. Never invited to sit. Never asked to leave. A stray thing kept indoors for winter. Lady Vivian's eyes gleamed as if she had only just discovered the phrase and wished the whole room to admire it. "That is what you are, is it not?" she asked gently. A stray thing kept indoors for winter. The words landed without a sound. Clara folded her hands before her, the way Mrs. Hale the housekeeper had taught her when she was 12 years old and too proud to weep in front of visiting ladies. Across the hall, a low sound broke through the silence. It came from beside the great hearth. Brutus, the old black hound who had slept there through every party for years without lifting his gray muzzle, was standing. His heavy paws pressed into the carpet, his ears angled forward. Every servant in Blackthorn Hall knew that Brutus no longer cared for strangers, music, or commands. He belonged to ghosts. He had once followed Lord Edmund Whitmore through field and forest, and after Edmund's death, the hound had become a shadow with a heartbeat. Now he moved, slowly at first, then with sudden purpose, crossing the room between silk gowns and polished shoes until he reached Clara's side. He placed his broad body in front of her and faced Lady Vivian. The laughter died. Lady Vivian's smile faltered. "What an unpleasant animal," she whispered. Clara's hand lowered without thought, her fingers resting lightly between the hound's ears. Brutus leaned back against her dress as if he had known that touch all his life. The sound that passed through the room then was not laughter. It was fear wearing manners. Duke Alexander descended the first step from the shadow of the balcony. Then another. Candlelight moved over his face, revealing the sharp restraint in his jaw, the faint pallor beneath his composure, and the grief he kept so tightly sealed that most mistook it for pride. He did not look at Lady Vivian. He looked at the old hound pressed against Clara's skirts. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and terrible in its quietness. "Miss Bennet," he said, "why does my brother's hound know you?" For one breath, Clara heard only the old hound breathing against her skirt and the faint whisper of snow tapping the tall windows. The Duke's question had not been loud, but it had traveled through Blackthorn Hall like a bell struck beneath water. "Why does my brother's hound know you?" No one moved. Lady Vivian held herself very still, her gloved fingers tightening around her fan until the painted ivory ribs bent slightly. The 10 rejected brides watched with faces arranged into delicate concern, though their eyes shone with hunger for scandal. Clara looked at Duke Alexander Whitmore and saw that his composure had not broken, not outwardly, but something behind it had shifted. His brother's name had not even been spoken, and yet the dead had entered the room. "Your Grace," Clara said carefully, "Brutus knew my father." It was the safest truth, the smallest truth, the kind that could stand in public without tearing down walls. Alexander's gaze did not leave her face. "Many men worked in my stables. Brutus did not cross a room for any of their daughters." Brutus pressed closer to Clara, as if answering for himself. She felt the warmth of the animal through the thin wool of her dress, steady and loyal, almost unbearably sad. She had been 14 when the hound first came to her father's door after Lord Edmund vanished, soaked with freezing rain, paws muddy, eyes wild with a grief no one could command away. Thomas Bennet had let him in by the kitchen fire. Clara had wrapped the trembling creature in an old horse blanket while her father stood at the window, watching the north woods with a lantern still burning in his hand. That memory rose now, bright and dangerous. She pushed it down. "I fed him sometimes," she said, "when he would not eat for anyone else." A murmur moved through the room. Harmless. Tender. Not enough. Alexander took another step down. When Clara's throat tightened. It was such a simple question. It asked for a date, nothing more. Yet dates were doors, and some doors in Blackthorn had been locked for 10 years. After Lord Edmund was lost, she answered. The Duke's face paled by a fraction. Only a fraction, but Clara saw it. Perhaps because she had spent years learning to notice the pain people hid beneath polished manners. Lost, Lady Vivian repeated softly, seizing the word as if it were a fallen jewel. How gentle of you, Miss Bennet. Most would call it a tragedy. Clara turned her eyes toward Vivian. Gentleness is not a crime, my lady. The words were quiet. They did not rise above the candlelight, but they reached every corner of the hall. Lady Vivian's smile thinned. Alexander looked from one woman to the other, and something colder than anger settled over his features. No, he said. It is not. The old hound gave a low, restless sound. Clara felt him shift, his head turning toward the eastern corridor. That corridor led away from the music room, past the portrait gallery, down toward the service passage and the side door that opened onto the stable yard. Brutus stared into the darkness there, as if he heard footsteps that had not walked the earth in years. Alexander saw it, too. The Duke's hand lowered slowly to the banister. His signet ring caught the candlelight, a black stone set in gold, the ancient mark of Whitmore pride. He remembers something, Alexander murmured, so quietly that the guests nearest him leaned forward without meaning to. Clara's heart began to beat too hard. Dogs remember kindness, your grace. And fear. The word fell between them, not violent, not cruel, but heavy with winter. Clara's fingers tightened in Brutus's fur. She could feel the old scar beneath his coat near one shoulder, a thin raised line from a night no one in the house had ever properly explained. She had found it when she was a girl, while cleaning mud from him by the kitchen hearth. Her father had told her never to speak of it. Not to servants, not to guests, not to the young Duke, who had returned from boarding school with grief sealed behind his eyes and a house full of adults eager to teach him silence. Miss Bennet, Alexander said, and now his voice carried the command of a man accustomed to locked rooms opening before him. Did my brother's hound come to you that night? Clara did not answer at once. She looked beyond him to the portraits watching from the dark-paneled walls, generations of Whitmores in velvet, armor, lace, and judgment. She thought of Thomas Bennet's rough hands folding a stained handkerchief. She thought of a lantern swinging in snow. She thought of a boy's name spoken like a prayer and then forbidden by dawn. He came to my father, she said at last. Not to me. Alexander descended the final step. The room seemed smaller when he stood on the same floor as Clara, though 20 feet of marble still lay between them. And what did your father do? Clara's lips parted, but before she could speak, Brutus suddenly left her side and moved toward the eastern corridor. He did not run. He walked with solemn certainty, past Lady Vivian, past the frozen footmen, past the silver trays and dying music, toward the part of the house where no guests were ever invited. At the entrance to the corridor, the old hound stopped and looked back. Waiting. Alexander turned to Clara. In his eyes, she saw the first true fracture in the Duke of Blackthorn. Not suspicion, not pity, a question he had been afraid to ask for 10 years. Show me, he said. Clara did not move at first. The word show had entered the hall with the weight of a command, yet beneath it she heard something stranger, something almost human. A plea. Duke Alexander Whitmore stood before the assembled county, no longer the distant lord refusing brides beneath candlelight, but a man who had just watched the past rise from the floor and walk away on old paws. The guests waited for Clara to obey or tremble. She did neither. She looked toward the eastern corridor where Brutus stood beneath the archway, his gray muzzle lifted, his dark eyes fixed upon the shadows beyond. Your Grace, she said, some memories are not fit for a ballroom. A faint rustle passed through the room. Lady Vivian Cross gave a small laugh, too delicate to be honest. How mysterious. One would think Miss Bennet had been entrusted with state secrets rather than stable gossip. Alexander did not look at her. Lady Vivian, I have heard enough from those who speak easily. The words were quiet, but they closed around the room like iron. Lady Vivian's face lost its practiced warmth. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment, not in defeat, but to gather the fragments of courage that had always had to be used sparingly. Then she followed Brutus. The old hound turned at once, leading the way down the eastern corridor. Alexander walked several paces behind Clara, and behind him came the uncomfortable hush of people who knew they were witnessing something they had not been invited to understand. No orchestra played, no glass chimed. Only footsteps moved over the stone floor, Clara's soft and careful, the Duke's measured and restrained, Brutus's claws tapping with solemn certainty. The corridor narrowed as they passed the portrait gallery, where painted Whitmores stared from gilt frames as if offended by the disturbance of truth. A draft slipped beneath the doors and carried the scent of snow, beeswax, and old wood. Clara remembered walking this passage as a child with a basket of folded blankets against her chest, her father's lantern swinging ahead of her, his voice telling her which doors to avoid when noble guests were staying. She had belonged to the hidden paths of Blackthorn Hall long before the grand rooms had learned her name. At the end of the corridor, Brutus stopped before the side door that opened to the stable yard. The iron latch was black with age. Beyond it, winter pressed against the house. The stables? Alexander asked. The east stable, Clara answered. It was closed the year after Lord Edmund died. His jaw tightened at his brother's name, but he nodded once. A footman hurried forward with a lantern, hands shaking so badly that the flames stuttered inside the glass. Alexander took it himself. The side door opened with a low groan, and cold air swept in, sharp enough to make several guests retreat. Clara stepped out first. Snow lay across the yard in a thin white veil, bright beneath the moon and the weak spill of lantern light. The east stable stood apart from the others, its roof dark, its windows boarded, its doors sealed by neglect rather than lock. No horses had slept there in years. No groom polished tack there. No child ran through its straw-sweet dusk. It had become one more place Blackthorn chose not to remember. Brutus reached the door and gave one firm push with his shoulder. The old wood shifted inward. Clara felt Alexander look at her. You have been here before. Yes, your grace. Recently. Often. His silence asked why. She answered because lies grow colder when no one visits them. The words remained inside her. Instead, she said, someone had to keep it from falling apart. The door opened wider. Inside, the stable breathed out the dry scent of hay, dust, leather, and winter trapped in timber. Lantern light crawled over empty stalls, rusted hooks, a cracked water pail, and the old center beam where her father had once tied his lantern on storm nights. Brutus walked straight to the last stall on the left and sat before it. Clara's pulse tightened. Alexander lifted the lantern. On the wooden post beside the stall, nearly hidden beneath age and shadow, were 3 small carved letters. E.W.B. Edmund Whitmore Blackthorn. Alexander stared at them as if they had spoken aloud. My brother carved that, he whispered. Clara nodded. He came here when he wanted to be only a boy, not an heir's brother, not a Whitmore, not a name people bowed to. Alexander's fingers hovered near the letters, but did not touch them. How would you know that? Clara swallowed. The old stable seemed to lean closer. Because my father let him. The lantern flame trembled as if it, too, understood that some rooms were built not to shelter horses, but to preserve what the living refused to say. Clara stood beside the last stall on the left, her hand resting lightly against the weathered wood where Lord Edmund's initials had been carved by a boy's uneven knife. Duke Alexander Whitmore remained very still. In the grand hall, his silence had felt like power. Here, in the abandoned east stable, it felt like pain taught to stand upright. My brother came here, he asked. Often, Clara said. Mostly in winter. Alexander's eyes did not leave the carved letters. He hated the cold. He said everyone thought that because he complained so loudly. A faint memory touched her voice before she could stop it. But he liked the stable when it snowed. He said the whole world went quiet enough for him to hear himself think. The Duke turned then, slowly, as though each word had moved something heavy inside him. You knew him. It was not accusation. Not exactly. It was worse. It was longing made formal. Clara folded her hands before her dress. The burn on her wrist pulsed beneath her sleeve, small and sharp, anchoring her to the present while the past pressed close around them. I was only 14, Your Grace. He spoke to my father more than to me. But you remember him? Yes. Brutus lowered himself to the straw with a tired sigh, his muzzle near the base of the stall post. The old hound's eyes remained open, watching them both. Clara looked down at him, grateful for his steady presence. Lord Edmund used to bring apples from the kitchen and pretend Brutus had stolen them. My father always knew, but he never told. For the first time, Alexander's expression changed with something like sorrow unguarded. Edmund used to steal apples from my breakfast tray. I thought he ate them himself. He gave most of them to Brutus. The Duke looked away, toward the boarded window where moonlight slipped through a narrow crack and drew a silver line across the dusty floor. Outside, the wind moved over the yard. Inside, years shifted in silence. I was told he had been careless, Alexander said. His voice was low, that he went too far into the north woods during a storm, that he lost his way. Clara felt the words her father had buried rise against her throat. Not yet, he had once warned her. Not until someone powerful enough wants the truth more than comfort. She had not understood then how rare such people were. That is what they told everyone, she said. Alexander turned back to her. Not what happened. Clara looked at the stall door, at the old iron hook beside it, at the place where her father's lantern had hung on the night the house changed. Your Grace, your brother did not die where they told you he died. The Duke's hand tightened around the lantern handle. The flame jumped, throwing his shadow high against the rafters. For a moment, he seemed carved from the same dark wood as the stable itself. Where? Clara drew a slow breath. Near the old bridge beyond the east pasture. Less than 1 mile from the house. The words struck harder because they were gentle. Alexander's eyes narrowed, not in anger at her, but at some invisible point in the past. That is impossible. Search parties were sent north. Yes. All of them went north. Yes, Your Grace. He understood then. Not the whole shape of it. Not yet, but enough for the air around him to change. Who sent them? Clara did not answer. She did not need to. The question itself had opened a door. Alexander's face grew colder, but beneath the cold was something raw and bewildered, a boy who had once been told where to mourn and had obeyed, because grief made obedience easier. Clara reached toward the old post and brushed away a layer of dust from a small brass nail hammered beneath the carved initials. Hanging from it was a strip of faded blue ribbon, almost colorless with age. He tied this here the afternoon before he vanished, she said. He told my father he was going to prove he was brave enough to cross the East Bridge alone. Alexander stared at the ribbon. My mother wore blue ribbons in her letters. Edmund kept them. He said blue meant home. The Duke closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were no longer the eyes of a man merely questioning a servant girl. They were the eyes of someone standing at the edge of a truth large enough to ruin every portrait in his house. From the stable doorway, a soft crunch of snow sounded. Clara turned. Lady Vivian stood just beyond the threshold, wrapped in white fur, her smile pale beneath the moon. How touching, she said. But I do wonder, Miss Bennet, how many convenient memories a charity girl can sell before a duke mistakes them for truth. Lady Vivian Cross did not step fully into the stable at once. She remained framed by the open doorway, moonlight silvering the fur at her shoulders, lantern glow touching the diamonds at her throat, every inch of her arranged to remind the world that some women were born to be believed. Behind her, several guests had gathered in the yard despite the cold, drawn by curiosity and the scent of scandal. Their faces hovered beyond the threshold like pale flowers in winter, eager, cautious, hungry. Clara felt the old familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear exactly. Fear was sharper. This was weariness, the kind that came from knowing a room had chosen its verdict before hearing a single word. Lady Vivian's smile deepened as she looked from Clara to the faded ribbon, then to Duke Alexander's rigid face. Your Grace, she said gently, I beg you to be careful. Grief makes generous listeners of us all. Alexander's eyes remained on her. Say what you mean. Gladly. She moved forward then, her satin shoes avoiding the scattered straw as though even the floor might offend her. Miss Bennet has lived under your roof for years. She knows the stories people whisper. She knows which wounds still ache. And tonight, after being laughed at in a ballroom, she suddenly remembers a secret that places her poor father at the center of a noble tragedy. Clara said nothing. Brutus lifted his head. The Duke's hand tightened around the lantern. You are accusing her of lying. I am suggesting she has learned survival. Lady Vivian tilted her head, almost kindly. There is no shame in that. A girl with no fortune must use whatever inheritance she has. A sad face, a dead father, a loyal dog, a duke with an old sorrow. The words were soft enough for drawing-room conversation and cruel enough to leave marks no one could see. A murmur moved among the guests beyond the door. Clara kept her hands folded, though the burn on her wrist stung fiercely now. She could feel every eye returning to its favorite conclusion. Clara Bennett, charity girl, overreaching. Clara Bennett, stray thing, reaching toward a title with a story. Alexander took one step forward, but Clara spoke before he could. My lady is mistaken. Her voice was quiet, not defensive, not pleading, merely clear. Vivian turned to her with bright satisfaction. Then correct me, Miss Bennett. Clara lifted her eyes. I did not suddenly remember. I have remembered every day. The stable fell silent. Even the wind seemed to press its ear against the boards. Clara looked at the carved initials, at the blue ribbon, at Brutus watching from the straw. I remembered when I cleaned this floor because no one else would come here. I remembered when the housekeeper told me not to ask why the East Bridge was never repaired. I remembered when your guests rode past my father's old quarters and lowered their voices as if poverty were contagious. I remembered when people called him careless, dishonest, foolish, and worse, while the men who knew better kept their hands clean. Lady Vivian's smile thinned. How dramatic. No, Clara said. Only late. Alexander turned toward her slowly. Something in that single word had reached him more deeply than anger could have. Late. Not false. Not grand. Late. Vivian gave a small sigh, then drew a folded handkerchief from her reticule. It was old linen, yellowed at the edges, marked with mud stains that time had darkened to brown. Since we are all honoring memory, she said, perhaps His Grace should see this. It was found years ago among Mr. Bennett's things, according to a former maid in my aunt's service. A Whitmore handkerchief, taken from the family, one assumes, before the unfortunate man was dismissed from trust. She held it out between two fingers, as if it were something unclean. Several guests whispered at once. Clara looked at the handkerchief and felt the world narrow. She knew that linen. She knew the small black thread at one corner, the uneven stitch where her father had mended a tear by candlelight. Alexander reached for it, his face unreadable. Lady Vivian's eyes shone with victory. There are explanations for everything, Your Grace. Even loyalty. The Duke unfolded the handkerchief. Clara saw the moment he noticed the embroidery. Not the proud crest Vivian expected. Not the formal mark of the ducal household. 3 small letters stitched in blue by a child's unsteady hand. E.W.B. Edmund Whitmore Blackthorne. Alexander stared at them. The color left his face. Clara's voice came softly through the cold. Your brother gave it to my father the night he came back from the East Bridge. Alexander did not speak at first. The handkerchief lay open across his gloved palm, small and faded, yet heavier than any seal or title in Blackthorne Hall. The 3 letters stared up at him in uneven blue thread, E.W.B., stitched with the clumsy care of a boy who had never expected his name to become a wound. Edmund had been 12 when he began marking his belongings that way, not because anyone stole from him, but because he liked the ceremony of belonging. His books, his riding gloves, even the ribbon tied around Brutus's collar had once carried those same little letters. Alexander remembered laughing at him for it. He remembered Edmund answering, "Things should know where home is." The memory struck so gently that it nearly brought him to his knees. Lady Vivian watched him closely, waiting for outrage to turn against Clara. The guests beyond the stable door waited, too. They expected a duke to defend his house, his crest, his dead, his version of history. They did not expect him to look suddenly less like a judge and more like a man who had found a letter delivered 10 years too late. Say that again, he said, his voice barely above the wind. Clara's fair face was pale in the lantern light, but her eyes did not fall. Your brother gave it to my father the night he came back from the East Bridge. Vivian laughed once, softly. Came back? Miss Bennet, Lord Edmund did not come back. That is the entire tragedy. Clara turned toward her. No, my lady. That is the story. The stable seemed to grow colder. Brutus rose from the straw and came to stand between Clara and the open doorway, not threatening, simply present, the last living witness with no language but loyalty. Alexander folded his fingers around the handkerchief. "Tell me." Clara looked at him then, not as a servant girl looks at a duke, not as the unwanted look at the powerful, but as one human being standing before another in the ruins left by silence. "My father found Lord Edmund near the East Bridge after sunset. He was frightened, wet from the snow, and shaking so badly that he could barely stand. Brutus was with him. My father brought them here first because the main house was full of guests, and he feared the boy would be scolded before he was warmed." Alexander's jaw worked once. He looked toward the empty stall, as if he might see his brother there, wrapped in a horse blanket, cheeks flushed from cold, pride wounded more than body. "Why was I never told?" Clara's voice softened. "Because before my father could bring him inside, someone came to the stable." Vivian's fan stopped moving. "How convenient. A shadowed visitor. A nameless villain. Every poor tale needs one." Clara did not look at her. "He was not nameless." The words settled like ash. Alexander's eyes sharpened. "Who?" Clara's lips parted, then closed. The name had lived in her mind for so long that speaking it felt like unlocking a grave. "Mr. Calloway," she said. A murmur passed through the guests. Several older men exchanged glances. Alexander went still. "My father's steward." "Yes, Your Grace. He died 5 years ago. That does not make him innocent." Lady Vivian stepped forward quickly. "This is beyond absurd. Mr. Calloway served your family with impeccable loyalty. Are we to believe the stable master's daughter knows more than every gentleman who searched that night?" Clara's gaze flicked to the handkerchief. Gentlemen searched where they were told to search. The Duke looked at her for a long, unblinking moment. Then, slowly, as if the action cost him something, he removed one glove and touched the blue stitches with his bare fingertips. His face changed. Not dramatically. Alexander Whitmore was not a man who shattered for an audience. But some hidden door within him opened, and grief stepped through with the face of a boy. "This was not stolen," he said. Vivian's expression faltered. "Your Grace." Edmund gave handkerchiefs away when he wanted to be brave. He once gave one to a kitchen maid who burned her hand, another to a groom whose horse had gone lame. He believed a Whitmore mark could protect people. Alexander looked at Clara's wrist, where the edge of her sleeve had slipped, revealing the small red burn she had hidden all night. His voice lowered. "Your father kept it because Edmund trusted him." Clara breathed once, unsteadily. No one had ever said it aloud. Not in a room with witnesses. Not with respect. Alexander turned toward the open stable door, toward the waiting faces, toward the world that had found it easy to doubt the dead stable master, and easier still to diminish his daughter. When he spoke, his voice carried through snow and candlelight alike. "Bring every record from the winter my brother died. Every letter. Every account. Every payment made by Mr. Calloway. Before this night ends, Blackthorn will learn the difference between loyalty and silence." Lady Vivian went pale. Clara looked at him, and for the first time since she was a child, the truth did not feel like a burden she carried alone. The order passed through Blackthorn Hall faster than the winter wind. Servants hurried from the records room with ledgers bound in cracked leather, old letters tied in gray ribbon, account books smelling of dust and cold ink. The noble guests returned to the great hall because scandal preferred warmth, and because no one wished to miss the moment when a duke either saved a girl's name or destroyed it. Clara walked behind Alexander in silence, Brutus close at her side. She could still feel the stable air on her skin, the weight of her father's memory no longer hidden beneath straw and dust. In the ballroom, the rejected brides stood like pale statues beside their mothers, no longer speaking of marriage. Lady Vivian Cross held her chin high, but the color had not returned to her face. Alexander placed Edmund's handkerchief on the long oak table where, only an hour earlier, contracts and marriage settlements had waited for noble signatures. "Mr. Hale," he said to the old steward who had served after Calloway's death, "read the payments from the winter of my brother's passing." The steward's fingers trembled as he opened the ledger. His voice was thin at first, then steadier as truth found its way into the room. 3 payments, each large enough to silence a household for a year, had been made under Calloway's authority to men assigned to the northern search. Another payment had gone to a physician who never examined the east pasture. A final sum had been recorded as repair for the east bridge, though the bridge had never been touched. The room changed with every line. It did not erupt. Noble rooms rarely did. It stiffened. It chilled. It learned that silence could have receipts. Alexander listened without moving, his face carved from restraint, but Clara saw the faint whitening of his bare hand where it rested beside the faded handkerchief. When the reading ended, he lifted his eyes to the guests. "My brother was not failed by weather," he said. "He was failed by men who preferred an easy story." No one answered. Lady Vivian's fan opened with a sharp snap. "Your Grace, even if Mr. Calloway made errors, that hardly proves Miss Bennet's father innocent of all suspicion." Alexander turned toward her. "No, Edmund proves it." He took the handkerchief in one hand and Clara's father's old lantern hook in the other, a small iron piece the footman had brought from the stable post at his command. "My brother marked what he loved. He marked what he trusted. If he gave this to Thomas Bennet, then my house had no right to stain that man's name." Clara felt her breath catch. Not because he defended her, because he did not make it beautiful. He made it just. Alexander faced the room fully, the black stone of his ring dark against the pale linen. "Thomas Bennet sheltered my brother. Thomas Bennet kept faith when this house rewarded him with suspicion. His daughter has carried a truth that should have been carried by those with titles, education, and power." His gaze moved to Clara, and for one moment, the entire glittering room fell away. "I have ignored 10 noble answers tonight because I was listening for one honest heart." Lady Vivian looked as if she had been struck by sunlight. A countess whispered, "Impossible." Alexander descended from the table's edge and walked toward Clara. The guests parted without being asked. He stopped before her, not towering now, not judging, not rescuing for sport. He looked at her as if apology alone would be an insult to all she had endured. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice low enough to belong only to her and clear enough for the room to hear. "I cannot undo the years this house made you invisible." Clara's fingers tightened in her skirt. "No, Your Grace. You cannot." Something like respect crossed his face, deep and quiet. "Then let me begin with the truth." He turned, and before every noble family who had laughed at her, he lowered himself to one knee. The sound that moved through the hall was not a gasp, but a surrender of certainty. Alexander held out the Whitmore ring, black stone in gold, ancient and severe in his palm. "I have searched tonight among names, and found only rehearsed virtue. I looked last where pride had taught me not to look, and there stood the one person in this house who understood loyalty without reward, dignity without protection, and courage without applause." Clara stared at him, her heart beating so hard that the candlelight seemed to flicker with it. Brutus stood beside her like a guardian from another life. Alexander's eyes did not leave hers. "Clara Bennet, would you do me the honor of allowing my name to stand beside yours, not above it?" The room went utterly silent. But Clara did not reach for the ring. Not yet. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to tremble and strong enough to wound. "Would you still ask me, Your Grace, if the truth destroys your house?" Alexander remained on one knee, the Whitmore ring resting in his open palm, while Clara's question moved through the great hall with more force than any accusation. "Would you still ask me if the truth destroys your house?" No one breathed easily after that. Lady Vivian stood near the fireplace, her face composed by habit and shaken by fear, while the rejected brides watched as if the world had tilted beneath their satin shoes. Duke Alexander Whitmore looked up at Clara Bennet, and in the stillness between them, he understood what the room did not. She was not refusing him. She was refusing to be rescued without justice. She was refusing to become a pretty ending placed over an ugly wound. Slowly, Alexander closed his hand around the ring and rose to his feet. A whisper passed among the guests, small and satisfied, as though they believed the spell had broken. But Alexander did not step away from Clara. He turned toward the long oak table, toward the ledgers, letters, payments, and the faded handkerchief marked by his brother's childish blue thread. "Then let it be destroyed," he said. The room went cold. Clara's eyes widened, not with triumph, but with the startled pain of someone who had never expected power to choose truth over its own comfort. Alexander faced the guests. "If Blackthorn Hall stands only because a good man was doubted, a grieving boy was misled, and an innocent daughter was made small for the convenience of noble pride, then Blackthorn deserves to fall before it is rebuilt. Lady Vivian gave a breathless laugh. Your Grace, surely you do not mean to stain your own name before the county because of one servant girl's memory. Alexander looked at her then, and whatever warmth had begun to awaken in him did not reach that gaze. Do not mistake restraint for uncertainty, Lady Vivian. Her lips parted, but no answer came. He turned to Mr. Hale. At first light, send riders to every magistrate within 30 miles. Send for the old bridge records, the physician's correspondence, and every servant who left Blackthorn during Mr. Calloway's final year. Until this matter is heard openly, no marriage contract will be signed in this house, and no guest will repeat Thomas Bennet's name with suspicion under my roof. Mr. Hale bowed, his eyes bright. Yes, Your Grace. Clara stood very still. The proposal had not vanished, yet it had changed shape. It was no longer a ring held up to silent scandal. It was a man stepping into the ruin his family had avoided for 10 years. Alexander turned back to her, softer now, though the entire hall could still hear him. Miss Bennet, I asked you poorly. Clara's fingers trembled once at her side. You asked generously. No, he said. I asked as a duke accustomed to believing that choosing something made it safe. But you were worthy before I saw you. Your father was honorable before I defended him. And truth does not become true because I finally have the courage to speak it. The words settled over Clara like warmth after a long winter, not enough to erase the cold, but enough to prove it was not eternal. Brutus leaned against her skirt, and she lowered one hand to his head, steadying herself in the old hound's quiet loyalty. Then what are you asking now, Your Grace? She whispered. Alexander held the ring not toward her hand, but between them, a promise not yet claimed. Nothing tonight. Not your answer. Not your gratitude. Not your future. Only permission to earn the right to ask again when your father's name is clean. The silence that followed was different from the silence of mockery. It was deeper, heavier, ashamed. Clara looked around the hall where she had once been laughed at, dismissed, and measured by the plainness of her dress. Now every eye lowered before hers, not because she had become a duchess, but because she had remained herself until the truth had no choice but to kneel. Lady Vivian stepped backward, her emerald skirts brushing the hearth rug, her victory gone from her face. The 10 noble brides stood forgotten in their jewels, and beyond the windows, snow drifted over Blackthorn like a white cloth laid upon the past. Clara looked at Alexander again. At first light, she said, we begin with the East Bridge. His expression changed, touched by something too quiet to be called hope and too solemn to be called joy. At first light, he agreed. He placed the Whitmore ring on the table beside Edmund's handkerchief, not as an offer withdrawn, but as a vow waiting for justice. And that night, beneath the trembling candles of Blackthorn Hall, the Duke did not win the girl no one wanted. He chose the truth everyone had feared, and in doing so, he finally became worthy of standing beside her.